Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is week 37, Branagh and the Bard.
That's right. This week we are the Shakespearelings.
Yeah, so we're talking about the films of Kenneth Branagh, who is probably most known for his Shakespeare adaptations. And we'll be looking into 3 of those, and he has done other things, but he is an actor and director. And Alex, you want to give us a little bit of background on Kenneth Branagh?
Sure. Other than he did play Professor Gilderoy Lockhart in Harry Potter. If you use that as a reference, I know a lot of people these days use that as a handy reference. And he does feature a lot of people who are in Harry Potter in his films. So if you're interested in that, that's another good foot in the door for his films. But Kenneth Branagh himself was born in Belfast, North Ireland in 1960. So nowadays he's around 56. He's got a lot more Shakespeare adaptations left in him. And
other adaptations.
And other adaptations, that's true. And he kind of became a star of the stage before he really started his film career. He did a couple spots in some movies, like 2 movies and a bunch of TV shows, before he really broke out through his own Shakespeare adaptations, the first of which is Henry V, which we will be talking about today. But he's also more recently established more of a directing career, including recent stints as the director of Cinderella and Thor, and most recently he has another film that's about to come out called Murder on the Orient Express, adapted from the Agatha Christie novel. And he also started his own acting company, the Kenneth Branagh Theatre Company in London 2015, giving more roles to more actors in Shakespeare plays than maybe anyone else besides possibly Laurence Olivier, who also kind of had a obsession with Shakespeare films very similar to Branagh, which I find very interesting. But we aren't talking about Laurence Olivier today. We are talking about Kenneth Branagh and his films. And what films would that be, Jonathan?
Yeah, so we're going to start off today, like you said, with Kenneth Branagh's directorial debut, Henry V from 1989, which won Best Costume Design and was nominated for Best Actor, which is Kenneth Branagh as the title character. And Kenneth Branagh does star and direct all 3 of these films today. So we're going to get into a little bit of the acting realm today, which we haven't delved too much into yet. But he was nominated for Best Actor and Best Director, which is pretty impressive for a directorial debut.
Right. And then we're going to take a look at one of his comedic adaptations in Much Ado About Nothing from 1993, which was nominated for Best Comedy at the Golden Globes. It wasn't nominated for anything at the Oscars, but it is a key part to our discussion today.
And we'll be wrapping up with Hamlet from 1996, Kenneth Branagh's Shakespearean magnum opus, if you will. It is fully unabridged Shakespeare script, which is very rarely done on stage or on film. And that was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Art Direction and Set Design, and Best Costume Design, and also Best Original Score.
Holy Hamlet, it is a long film. Strap yourselves in for that one. I don't think this will be a 4-hour podcast. Who knows? It might be. I doubt it. But it is a 4-hour film, so lots to talk about there. So the first film we're going to talk about today is Henry V from 1989. And our intros to these films will be a little interesting this week because you've probably heard them all in your high school English class. Because they're all Shakespeare plays. They're all Shakespeare plays. They're all classics.
So no spoilers this week. We're going to just go all out.
Yeah, I mean these are all written like the 1600s. I feel like we've passed the spoiler mark. Like 3 centuries, we're good. We're good.
Yeah.
But anyway, Henry V tells the story of King Henry V of England, who is the King of England, and during the latter part of the 100 Years' War, which is a series of conflicts between England and France, mostly discussing what rights I say discussing, like war isn't discussion. It's much more violent than that. But it had a lot to do with the leftover claims to French lands that the Norman conquerors had when they took over the English throne. And now that it's thoroughly English, by the time Henry V is king, they still have claims, but the French are like, no, we're not okay with that. This is France, not England, and there's fighting involved. And Henry V, at the beginning of this play or film, and we're talking about the film, decides that he wants to assert those claims. So that's what he goes and does, and reinvades France after almost being killed. There's a little scene where people try to assassinate him, and he breaks up their plot pretty effectively. But once in France, we deal with the events leading up to, concerning, and following the famous Battle of Agincourt, where a very, very small English force destroyed a much larger French army, and allowed Henry V to escape back to England and continue his assertions on the French throne. But we aren't really concerned with military history today. We are concerned with the character of King Henry V. And I find it interesting at the beginning of this film, and this is something we're going to be talking about a lot today, is what you can do when you adapt a story designed for the stage to cinema, to a film format. And in the play, originally they have this character, the chorus of the play, who kind of comes out between big scene transitions, big location transitions, and it might actually just be
and
at the
also
beginning of every act.
prologuing and epiloguing.
Yeah. And kind of sets the stage for you. And his dialogue concerns a lot about like putting it into your mind, like all the things that are happening in the scene that you can't see because it's on a stage. And it's really interesting when you take that and put it into the film format, because we have the chorus played by Derek Jacobi here, who is also in Hamlet. He plays the evil king in Hamlet, playing the chorus. And he walks us through like the back, dark but wonderfully lit backstage area of a theater house, kind of introducing us to the story. And it's this very self-conscious way to introduce a story, and it's a very theatrical way to introduce a story, not just because like he's walking through the background of a theater. I mean, it's very dramatic for drama's sake, in a very enjoyable way that kind of just gets you warmed up for what you're about to see and get you excited for what you're about to see.
Yeah, and honestly, he's walking through a soundstage, which I did not notice until kind of the second time I replayed through that bit, because there's actually cameras there and stuff like that. But you really can't tell if it's backstage of a stage or a film soundstage, which is kind of the point, because he's trying to get us in this mindset of, pulling, stage material onto film. And it's really interesting that we start with this one, because Shakespeare has that chorus in there, like you said, describing, basically setting up for the audience. All right, here, we're going to be putting on this story for you, and we're not going to be able to encapsulate everything on this stage because there's just too much going on in this historical epic. So you're going to have to imagine some things. And that actually sets up for a lot of the things that we see Kenneth Branagh doing, because he didn't have like the biggest blockbuster budget for this movie. So he makes do with less and lets the audience fill in the blanks, very much in the same kind of way that you would do in a theatrical production. So even though we can see more, we can do more with film, there's still things that we have to fill in and have to imagine. And I think we're going to see that in all three of these films, is how Branagh uses specifically filmic and cinematic techniques and things that can only be done through cinema, but also keeping a very theatrical sense to all of these productions.
Yeah, and the opening few minutes of Henry V is very is very well attuned to the fact that it is film, that it is cinema, and it lights, like, I mean, just the things they do in the first few scenes in the castle, where before we even meet Henry, and then when we first see Henry as king, it's just beautifully, beautifully lit. And those are lighting things and shots that can only be pulled off in cinema, in this world where you can create a scene and put the camera anywhere you want in the scene, as opposed to theater. And it takes advantage of all you can do with where you can put a camera and the silent moments in between it that you can't enjoy quite as well on stage. Like the moment when Henry walks into his throne room for the first time, and there's like this fog everywhere, and there's this beautiful golden warm light behind him, and you just see his silhouette appear, and you see him kind of slowly walk in, and all of his attendants, all of the dukes and counts, like turn to see him. Completely silent, no dialogue, but it's such a cinematic sequence of really impressively done drama that couldn't be done on the stage, can only be done in a film format, that is interjected into a traditionally theatrical play. And that's something that is done very well all across Henry V. In spite of the low budget, they pull off all of those really interesting cinematic moments, which is just fascinating over the course of the play, including the battle. I was really shocked by how well the battle turned out.
Yeah, but real quick, just to kind of be a little clear about the fact that all of these films are period pieces. These first two are actually set in the time period that the story would be set in. In Henry V, it's the 1400s. And Much Ado About Nothing is probably the 1600s, probably modern time for Shakespeare. So everything is lit by candles and firelight, and which lends to some very cinematic and interesting things. But that is used to almost impressionistic effect in Henry V. So like you say, that first instance when he's walking into his throne room, like almost the first thing we see after the chorus and a quick little scene is two gigantic doors opening up. And we know how the Impressionists loved their really tall doors and tall chairs and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah, big doors.
So we have these two giant doors opening with this really warm orange, what we can assume is firelight behind Henry as he's silhouetted walking in, and he just gets bigger and his shadow gets bigger. And then through all that scene, all the indoor scenes, we have this warm firelight that's lighting people's faces and the use of shadows in this film. For example, there's a shot where at the first little village that they capture, and when the battle's almost over, we're seeing Henry correspond with someone from the city who's on top of the wall of the city, and we're looking down, and we see Henry from above on his horse, like just bathed in this really blue moonlight, contrasting with the red fire glow of the city that's on fire. And it's like, again, all of these things in this film more than any of the other ones, which are a little bit more evenly lit for slightly different reasons, which we'll get into. But this one definitely feels impressionistic and feels dramatic and cinematic because it needs to have that epic sense to it, because it is an epic story. And the more that you can add to that when you don't have hundreds of extras that you can use and stuff like that, the more that you can build that sense just atmospherically really helps.
Yeah. And the epic scale in this one is maybe even bigger than you would think at first, because a lot of it's kind of a tangent, but a lot of Shakespeare's historical plays are actually interconnected. And Henry V, the character, appeared in both Henry IV plays, as a kid. And this moment when we see Henry V walk in as the king and assert himself confidently, and all of the moments that we interact with some of the characters who were in the last plays, like Falstaff, who is in this play only in memory.
Right.
they're part of this bigger universe, the Shakespeare theatrical universe, as I like to call it. And no one make movies like that. No one do that. I think it would be epic if done well. I just don't have confidence that somebody could pull it off. But if they would, if somebody would do it, it would be Kenneth Branagh in the style of Henry V. So actually, yeah, let me rephrase. I want Kenneth Branagh to do a Shakespeare cinematic universe where he does Henry V, both Henry IVs, Henry VI, Richard II, all of those ones that are interconnected there in like the 15th and 14th centuries in England. Like, just put them all together. I want to see that done.
Yeah, that'd be great. But like, since this film is made independently of any of those other stories that Shakespeare had written and which are all kind of conjoined, Branagh has to establish all of these characters independently, which he does. And so, like you're saying, we're seeing the peasants talk about Falstaff, who is dying, and we have no, if we're just walking into this film fresh, we have no basis to understand Falstaff. And then we cut in flashbacks and stuff like that. And I think there are actually flashbacks built into the script. But those are the things, like you said, setting up Branagh's Henry V as this very strong character right off the bat is great, because we don't have to go back and like understand or pull out a history textbook. Branagh is telling us just through some of these impressionist and visual cues what we're to be feeling about certain characters. And like, again, with the peasants, when we're setting up the scene of all the peasants having fun and laughing, and Henry V is there. And again, we have that very warm glow, and it's this very familial and fun setting, which is then contrasted later on by things like one of them getting hanged in front of, or by the order of Henry V, who used to be drinking buddies with him, but now he has a different role, and he has to fulfill different responsibilities. And the way you're contrasting that very warm glow in the flashbacks to a very cold, misty morning, muddy in the
lots of mud and blood in this film.
Right, in the forest. It's giving you that contrast, and it really punches in the emotional cues that, in a way that, using, again, as we always talk about, the cinematic rhetoric of, what's it called? Color psychology and stuff like that, are ways that you can get that across in film, which you can do in theater, but being able to completely fade from one setting to another is just a way to bring that full effect on more than you can on stage.
Yeah, and this is and since we are in the cinematic universe, he can pull off those flashbacks to a really, really strong effect that did not exist in the original play version. I feel like it was pretty obvious that performance is going to be a big topic on this week's episode, talking about a stage actor turned director / film star. And it certainly is, because we're talking about Shakespeare, who is almost every actor's just like favorite playwright. Like, I feel like almost every actor just loves Shakespeare, and Kenneth Branagh is no exception. In fact, he's maybe the best example of that. But the acting in all three of these films is incredible, mostly because, in my opinion, you can,
aside from the star-studded cast,
it starts from the star-studded cast, but you can turn off the sound, or let's say you didn't understand what they were saying, which is possible for some people because it's Shakespearean language, and not everybody gets that right off the bat. I kind of have to warm up every time I listen to it before I really get into it. But you don't fully have to comprehend the words they are saying to understand what is happening in a scene and where the tensions are in a scene, and how, like we were talking about, how strong and assertive Henry V has become at the very, very start of this play. And you can feel that in every scene without having to listen to the words that are being said, which is always a sign of great performances and great directing. It's interesting because Roger Ebert did a review of this film, in particular Henry V, where he talks about where he compares it to the Laurence Olivier version, because Laurence Olivier went on his own little streak of making Shakespearean films as the actor / director. But he says that Laurence Olivier kind of had all of his actors play more for comprehension of the words, whereas Kenneth Branagh kind of had more of his actors play more for the emotion behind the words. And I haven't seen the Laurence Olivier versions, but I definitely like the Kenneth Branagh take on these kinds of performances. Especially combined with all of the film techniques that he uses. I think it works really well to effectively convey the emotional storyline along with the actual plot line that we are seeing over the course of the film.
Yeah, and that gets into this idea that we haven't talked about before, but is kind of out there, where directors will often kind of fall in the camp of being an actor's director or more of, say, like a technical director. So, for example, Stanley Kubrick came into directing from photojournalism and was very aware in particular about the very technical aspects of cinematography and how to, like how to set your f-stop on the camera, or t-stop, I guess, since it's cinema. But, but on the other side, you have Kenneth Branagh, who comes from a theater background, comes from a Shakespearean training. So he understands the words and understands the emotions and is able to use that in his own performance. But as the director, he's able to help infuse that into his other actors. And as we've talked about, he has some really huge names in these films. And I don't know like what all of their experience with Shakespeare is, but I assume they're not as well versed in Shakespeare as Kenneth Branagh himself, as such an enthusiast as we could see from all these adaptations. But, being able to understand the material so much just from his background and then direct his actors that way brings out some really amazing performances. And we're going to see that in all of these. And that's what lets him do some of the things that he does with the cinematography. For example, one of the things that we're going to be talking about throughout this whole episode again is the one takes that Kenneth Branagh does, which I think we've talked about before, but just the very long takes of without cutting. And that in these films particularly adds a very theatrical element to them, and it lets that acting play out in front of the camera without getting broken up into little shots and like having to stop the actors and set them up in a close-up and do a different shot and stuff like that, like we talked about a little bit with the Frank Capra episode. So, for example, there's a scene where Judi Dench's character, Lady Quickly, is mourning the death of Falstaff, and all the peasants are sitting on this staircase in a very tableau kind of fashion, which I think we've talked about before also.
We have.
And plays into all of these movies again, is this idea of tableau. But basically the camera starts in a wide shot and zooms in on her face. She basically has this very long soliloquy that lasts a couple minutes, and we zoom into a close-up on her face, and then we zoom back out to a full shot, or a wide shot without ever cutting, and it lets her entire performance play out, and we see it and we get both of those frames, but we get it all in one take, and it lets the emotion continue to build and play out as it would on a stage. And then adding the element of the camera motion and seeing her face and her emotion in a close-up as well as the wide shot adds that cinematic element that you don't get on stage.
There is a fantastic oneer at the end, towards the end of this film, where Christian Bale, who is in this film, has died and is being carried across the battlefield by King Henry V. And it's after they've kind of realized they won the battle, but the French have attacked the baggage train and killed all of the young boys who were dealing with the baggage train, which was a big no-no. Like, just to put a cultural context on that was not something you did.
I was not angry since I came to France until this moment.
There you go. Yeah, see? Yeah, for those of you who didn't know, quick fun trivia fact about the Filmlings: Jonathan used to be an actor. Um, in fact,
Guilty.
the first time I ever heard about Jonathan was when somebody was like, there's this guy named Jonathan. He was in the school's production of Aesop's Fables. And my response, and keep in mind I was very young at the time, was like, boys can act? I was
Kenneth Branagh has proved you.
Yeah. I don't know. I had seen movies at that point. I just hadn't put it together. I don't know why. And it's not something I think anymore, obviously, but that was just a fun fact. That was my first reaction. But anyway, this fabulous wonder where, you know, the emotion is already high because so many characters have died. We just saw this very gory mud and blood fight battle scene, which is done really well on a very small budget with, you know, horse charges and arrows and fighting in the mud.
Using a lot of close-ups, to convey the scale.
Yeah, which is a good way to deal with the fact that they didn't have a huge budget. And you know, the emotions are already high, and you see that all these boys are dead, and King Henry is very emotional, and you're probably feeling it too. And just this long wonder of him carrying the boy, that conveys so much of the emotion of the moment of like, this is tragic, we won, but this is tragic, like the bittersweetness of it all as he carries it across. And of course, you know, there's music underneath, so you can really get that full-fledged emotional swell over the course of this long wonder.
Yeah, and that wonder goes like, from one end of the battlefield to the other, and in the background you see just mud and bodies and you know, puddles of blood and people picking up bodies, and it's just, you know, all this carnage in the background. And also I believe when that bit starts there, all of the soldiers and stuff begin a song, and they start
they do,
you know, singing, and that adds to this emotion, which then fades away into the score. But it's one of the best silent moments in this film, and we'll talk a little bit, especially in Hamlet, about, you know, how like the difference between how many silent moments there are in these movies versus other movies, because there's so much worded content from Shakespeare that is great, and how those emotions are conveyed through words in Shakespeare. But it's just this great moment where Branagh just lets you take in what's going on and lets you see everything that's going on. And using that as a wonder again is a theatrical, but it's also uniquely cinematic because it's a tracking shot, and because it's so it takes such a huge just geographical scope, this walk from one end to the other, that you could not convey on a stage that's however many feet long, you know.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about our second film of the day, Much Ado About Nothing, from 1993. But the original play from Shakespeare's day would have been pronounced a little closer to Notting, without the H there, which meant it's kind of a slang word for gossip. So Much Ado About Gossip, Much Ado About Nothing, you know, Shakespeare, wordplay, yada, yada, yada. Wink, wink. But that kind of gets to the heart of what the play is about, doesn't it, Jonathan?
Yes, it does. And actually, since you bring that up, I think there's a video, I'll see if I could find it again, that kind of talks about the pronunciation of Shakespeare from Shakespeare's time, and how that actually infuses more puns that we don't totally get anymore with our current pronunciation of the words. I'll see if I can find that, include that in the blog post. But Much Ado About Nothing. There is a lot of ado about what ends up being nothing. So basically,
so much ado.
Basically, we have a house of a noble, and the cast of characters. We have Beatrice, who is a quick-witted woman, and we have Hero, who is our naive young lass, and then Hero's father and his brother, and then along comes to visit two princes, played by Denzel Washington and Keanu Reeves, who are brothers, and it's Shakespeare, so we can do that. And
Keanu
that's
Reeves
one of the
is
things.
Adopted.
Oh, that's right. Well, he's a bastard.
He's a bastard, right?
Yeah.
Like Jon Snow.
And also Signor Benedict. And this does take place in Sicily, so we have very much that European vibe in some of these Shakespearean plays. And so this is a lot lighter than Henry V, obviously. This is one of Shakespeare's comedies. And so it revolves around the romance between Claudio and Hero and what ends up being a romance between Beatrice and Benedict. And basically, Claudio and Hero fall in love, for lack of a better word, naturally. And Keanu Reeves' character, Prince John, is just like the classic mustache twirling bad guy where he doesn't like anybody and he just is out to make everyone's life miserable. And he's the one who starts the gossip. So there's your notting. And the other characters all conspire to get Benedict and Beatrice together because they're both very witty and critical and stuff like this. And they're like, we should get them together because they both have railed against marriage for so long. So a plot ensues, and then all of the lies from Prince John kind of escalate. People are assumed to be dead, and
fake
all this
deaths.
Yes, very Shakespearean, as you can imagine, but also, just hilarious and so much witty dialogue and so many just funny things that once you get into the language, you start to be like, man, Shakespeare was so witty. Like these lines are great. And then thrown into all this mess is Michael Keaton's character, Dogberry, who is
oh my gosh.
Like a constable or something. He is just the most ridiculous thing. And if you're a fan of Michael Keaton, you need to watch this movie.
Well, Jonathan, don't you know, he's an ass.
Yes. Make no mistake. Let it be written down. Michael Keaton is an ass.
Yeah. This makes a record, doesn't it? This is the number one actor or the most referenced actor
probably
on the Filmlings. I would be interested to see. I want to say he is. But anyway, I visited.
Tweet us actor stats on our podcast, people.
Someone do free work for us and correlate stats on the films we've covered. Actually, yes, please do free work for us. We will give you a shout. We pay in shout outs.
If that's any incentive.
If that entices you. No health benefits, just shout outs. I always find it so interesting. I visited this this play before, but I've never watched it. I've never watched it be performed. I've never seen it on screen. But I always find it how interesting, how relatable these stories are, because Much Ado About Nothing is essentially what happens when somebody has a crush on somebody in middle school. Mm-hmm. Like it totally is. It's like, oh, like, let me go ask her if she likes you. Like this is exactly what happens. And it's so interesting because it's intensely relatable, but it's got the romance of a period drama about it at the same time.
Yeah, and that's why Shakespeare has lasted this long, and we're not here to expound the merits of Shakespeare. Too many people have done that, but
we're not qualified.
Right. But yeah, it's that getting at the heart of things that we talk about what makes a movie good, is getting to something universal. That is the reason that Shakespeare has lasted for so many hundreds of years and has been translated into like every language. But yeah, and the fact that we can now turn them into movies and make it more accessible for people who are not going to take the time and sit down and read it, I think is great, because it's like that where we can see that. And again, Shakespeare is meant to be seen, to be watched and heard, and it makes it more comprehensible to see actors who have internalized and understood the material perform it and put the emotion into it and put the actions into it. Even just like certain actions and the way that the blocking is laid out just makes the words make more sense. And again, Branagh has that experience to know how to make these come across. And I think Much Ado About Nothing is probably the easiest to follow fresh out of any of these movies. I don't know if it's just because of the wit or the way that, again, it's kind of archetypal love story characters and stuff. Like, you can't, again, if you turn the sound off, you kind of know what's going on. You know that the characters are bantering with each other. You know that Keanu Reeves hates everybody. You know that Denzel Washington just loves everyone and wants everyone to get along. He's so great in this.
I love Denzel Washington.
He's great. Yeah, all the actors, again, it's star-studded cast.
Yeah. And you know what? They're having fun. Like, you get that sense. And I love that fact about these films is that they're all passion projects, because Kenneth Branagh is obsessed with Shakespeare, and he's getting to put on a big performance of it on camera where he's the star. So, that's pretty lovable. But you also get the sense, and it's something you have to interpret, I don't know for sure, that the sets of these films were so fun to be on. Like, the people were just having fun making it. Because if you can't, it's hard to find better material to act than Shakespeare material. And Kenneth Branagh does a great job of building this platform for these actors to just really strut their stuff and do their thing and act Shakespeare, which is something that anybody who has learned to act has probably had to do at some point, is act Shakespeare.
Which is probably why we're seeing these actors who are in all three of these movies and in many more of Kenneth Branagh's productions, because again, he knows how to relate to actors. And like you're saying, it's giving them an outlet to perform some of the most tried and true material out there. But we're seeing, like, there must be at least 4 or 5 actors that are in all 3 of these movies, and even more who are in at least 2 of them. And Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson, who both star in Much Ado About Nothing, were married at this point. She was in Henry V. I think they were married for both of these films. But yeah, you do get that sense of camaraderie, which you need in this play, because, again, it's one of Shakespeare's lightest plays. And, Shakespeare, when he's dark, he's very dark. But when he's light, he's also extremely light and happy. And you get that joyous sense from the actors and also from the cinematography. Again, this Henry V was the most impressionistic, and this is probably the lightest. So it's very bright and colorful, and you get the fun Sicilian architecture and all of this stuff that all goes into just an enjoyable watching experience.
Yeah, all these actors hanging out in what seems to be like a Mediterranean paradise, just having fun. And maybe the best culmination of that is oh gosh, I want to say it's the very last shot of the film. I would bet you money that it's the very last. Okay, it is. But the last shot of the film is this very long oneer, like we mentioned in Henry V, with lots of flower petals being thrown in the air. So many flower petals, as everyone's dancing and singing a song and having fun, and that kind of just sums up the whole tone of the production of the film.
Well, to just describe this oneer, because it is really an amazing shot.
It's complex.
We start kind of in the, for lack of a better word, backyard of this villa, and I think Kenneth Branagh says, like, one last line, like, "Let's all be merry" or something. And then again, they start singing and everyone dances, and we go through a doorway into a courtyard, and then we go out into the gardens. And then they manage to put the camera on a crane, and it goes up into this big shot of, like somewhere between 20 and 50 actors all dancing around this big lush garden. And it just sums up how joyous and what a big kind of party this movie kind of was, even though it has those ups and downs of Shakespeare. It all gets resolved. It's everyone realizes it was Much Ado About Nothing, and nothing about gossip. And again, we get that oneer, and there are some other oneers in this, but that is definitely the most remarkable of them. But one of the other things that we see in all three of these films that we can kind of talk about is soliloquies. And in this one, probably have the most fun soliloquies. But let's talk a little bit about kind of the use of soliloquies in movies, because that is not something that we see hardly ever.
Yeah, no, most films, most mainstream films throughout the course of film history have been about scenes where an actor is in conflict with either another actor or something physical. It's very rare that you have an actor just standing around talking to the camera or talking out loud. That's a very theatrical thing, and something that most people just can't seem to do right on camera. And not like the actors, but like everything that has to come together to make it work isn't really easy to accomplish, especially in modern cinema, which is very grounded in realism. It's not something that would really fit well. But Shakespeare is very soliloquy heavy, and Kenneth Branagh does a good job again of giving the actors the platform and the space to move around and act out and express what you express in a soliloquy, which is typically some kind of internal conflict. And I think my favorite two in this film are when so their friends are trying to trick them into believing that Benedict and Beatrice are being tricked by their friends into thinking that the other one likes them, so that they would suddenly decide to like the other one, which works, by the way, which is shocking. But they both
try it out, kids.
Don't try it out, kids. That's a terrible idea. Don't emulate Shakespeare. Don't know, unless you're writing, but not an act. But yeah, they're expressing their confusion over this. And they both get the chance to kind of move around. They're both in the garden when it happens, and they get to move around the garden.
Different areas.
Different areas of the garden, yes. And interact with the scenery, and the camera gets to move around them to kind of give them the space to really just, act and do their thing.
Yeah, and kind of the interesting thing about soliloquies is we often talk about show, don't tell, or we even bring up imply, don't tell sometimes. But that is kind of turned on its head with Shakespeare, because, again, he expresses so much emotion through these words, through his, combination of words and phrases and poetry. And so, Branagh doesn't feel the need to add a whole lot to that. We'll see in Hamlet, he'll add a couple things just to help explain some things or show some things. But in these films, for the most part, when someone is giving a soliloquy, he just lets the actor work, and he keeps a one shot on them. So these are also oneers for the most part, even if they're not as grand as the final battle or the final party in this movie. But he just holds on them and follows them and lets them do their blocking, and the camera will just follow them. And really the only thing that I can think of in modern film that kind of comes close to this, again, we have show, don't tell. So often these kind of things are expressed through, montages or certain actions and stuff that are silent. But the only things I could think of that would come close to this are either a narration in, say, a noir film, like we saw with Old Boy, where he would pop in sometimes and just explain what he was feeling. But that's just a voiceover track over something else that we're seeing, or a musical number, honestly, where a character will, like Gene Kelly in Singing in the Rain, express his emotion through a song. But other than that, this technique of soliloquy has kind of died out from dramatic and really all forms of filmed stories. And it would be interesting to see, like, if there was a way to bring that back in some fashion or another.
It's kind of interesting because we've talked so much on this podcast about cinematic rhetoric, and today we're really going to explore some theatrical rhetoric and see how they blend and see where the line is between them. And they don't always work crossed over into the other medium. In fact, I'd say most of cinematic rhetoric wouldn't work at all in theater. Some of them are doable, but just the technology. Most of cinematic rhetoric is based on the fact that you have this technology to work with, which theater does not. But a lot of theatrical rhetoric can be blended into cinema. And when the story calls for it, like we have in Much Ado About Nothing, we can see how a director tackles making that theatrical rhetoric not only like work, but like compelling at the same time in the cinematic format that we see here today. And I would say the soliloquies in Much Ado About Nothing work, and not for any technical reason, but just for the reason that when you watch them, they're funny and they're compelling.
Yeah, and again, I mean, this all goes back to the fact that Branagh is so familiar and well-versed with the material and is able to portray that. He knows how to say the words to get them to come across right. And that sounds trivial, but it's actually really important, especially in films like these where the language is becoming more and more antiquated. People are not being as well versed in this material. And so you have to be able to pull it off in order to get people to follow along. And especially when you're using Shakespeare's actual text and you're not like taking his concept and applying it to a story, kind of like a very loose adaptation.
Yeah, which has definitely been done a lot.
Yeah. And we could probably pull out a million examples, especially from Hamlet or, Romeo and Juliet, if you're, there's so many examples of that happening with Shakespeare. But when you're using his text, you have to be able to apply the right emphasis and emotion and all that. And he does it. And also with these two films, the first two, the way he cuts them really works. And I'm not an expert on either of these. I've read Much Ado About Nothing a long time ago, but he cuts them so that they make sense and you get what's going on, and it still fits within your 2-hour normal movie window. And that another example of how you can get that across through a performance is, again, Michael Keaton's character, who is so great as Dogberry, because basically his character trait is he is a pretty uneducated man who tries to express himself as being more educated than he is. So most of his comedy is wordplay because he doesn't understand what a whole lot of words mean. So people will say, for example, he's like prattling on to one of the characters from the villa, and and the character goes, "You're being so tedious. Like you're going on way too long." And he's like, "Oh, thank you, sir. If I were as tedious as a king, I would bestow some of that back upon your grace." And it's just like so confused because he doesn't know what the connotation of certain words. But if you're just reading the play, you may not get that across because it might just seem like Shakespeare doesn't know what he's talking about. But watching Michael Keaton play it and seeing how crazy he is really kind of emphasizes that wordplay in a way that, reading it on its own doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, you understand that it's a bit, that this character is supposed to just be stupid, or at least uneducated, I would say, not necessarily stupid.
Right.
But yeah, it's certainly, I think it's even funnier within our modern context, because, I feel like I'm pretty good at understanding Shakespeare, but there are definitely times when I will get a little lost here and there, and having another character who is also getting lost in the play and it's funny to the other characters is partially reassuring, but also very funny.
Yeah, and it's so great that Shakespeare can write, he can write the the Battle of St. Crispian speech from Henry V, you know, we few, we happy, we band of brothers, one of the greatest kind of pep talks in literature history. And then he could turn around and write Dogberry, who repeatedly proclaims, I am an ass, and just like has the most ridiculous, uneducated dialogue. And that just like goes into the range and why we keep seeing these stories show up again and again. And speaking of stories that show up again and again, let's talk about perhaps one of the most adapted, performed, used for inspiration, you know, one of the most quintessential stories just of all time, Hamlet, and Kenneth Branagh's adaptation from 1996.
The film that wouldn't end, Hamlet, except it did end like 4 hours afterwards, and it is thoroughly enjoyable. You just you have to prep. You have to do.
It was so long, most of the characters were dead by the end.
Oh, ouch! That was funny.
We got jokes this week.
We got jokes. We got Shakespeare jokes. But yeah, no, do your movie prep before you watch this film. You know, plan out, block out 4 hours of your time. Go get the right movie blanket. Go get your right popcorn bucket. Go get your right popcorn. You know, cozy up. Get a movie buddy. Cozy up to them if that's, you know, what your friendship or relationship is like, if that's cool with you guys. And get ready and strap yourselves in because this film is worth it, but it is long. And it is Shakespeare. And once you get into it, you're into it. I almost appreciate that about this film, that switch that has to flip into my brain that says you understand Shakespeare now. You know, it takes like 15 minutes maybe. Happens at the start of every film. So I often replay those 15 minutes. But for this one, I could get into that, and then that period of time where I really understand Shakespeare lasted for 3 hours and 45 minutes. But maybe I should cut this intro short and talk about the description. I don't want to go on forever. Hamlet is the story of Hamlet, who Simba. Is a Danish prince whose father has died. He was in fact poisoned, and visits him as a ghost and is like, "Hey Hamlet, your uncle killed me, and now he married your mom," which is weird. And so Hamlet decides that he is going to find a way to prove this, and in order to act as a guise for him acting weird, he decides to basically just turn into the skid and act super weird, convince everybody that he's completely crazy as a cover for him finding a way to prove that his uncle killed his father so he could marry his mom and become king. And drama and tragedy ensue as person after person falls dead as a consequence of Hamlet's quest for revenge. And since we're not doing spoilers, we're not worried about spoilers today. He does get his revenge. He manages to kill the king, his uncle, and then he promptly dies because he was poisoned too. And then the king of Norway waltzes in and is like, "I'm king here now too." So yeah, everybody dies. Everybody dies.
Except Horatio.
Which I'm happy about.
Who almost killed himself. Yeah.
I really like Horatio. He was like, Horatio is, I swear we've talked about it before on this podcast, where sometimes there's an kind of an everyman character who is the entry point to a film for the audience, someone who you can relate to very easily. And he tends to be the least crazy, most understandable character on screen. And Horatio is that. He is Hamlet's friend from school, and they're very good friends. And he helps Hamlet too because he's seen the ghost. But he is the most sane character across the whole play, which is kind of saying something.
Yeah, so let's talk about, because a lot of the things we've already talked about are going to play in again here. But some things that are very cinematic come into play, especially at the beginning here, because this is, I think, the only one of these plays that actually has a supernatural element, which Shakespeare will throw in there sometimes, often in his tragedies. And in this case, it's the ghost. And so that is an opportunity for Branagh to bring in some very uniquely cinematic techniques. And we get some really cool like silhouettes, and then we get earthquakes and kind of magical forest stuff happening.
And you get to see the ghost, who looks very ghost-like.
Yeah, he was really creepy with whatever context they used. Were kind of amazing. I actually kind of found it interesting because the way they portray the ghost in this is that basically there's a statue of Hamlet's father, also named Hamlet, which I think people forget sometimes. At least I do.
That's fair enough.
But the statue essentially comes to life and embodies the ghost. And it's surrounded in fog and backlit and stuff like this. And it reminded me a whole lot to the introduction of Harakiri, which we talked about in our Japan week on the world tour, where they had that kind of feudal armor set and then lots of smoke and stuff, lending a very mystical element to it. And I don't know if that was just coincidence or if Kenneth Branagh was kind of homaging some classic Japanese cinema there.
Yeah, so talking about cinematic moments in Hamlet, I think my personal favorite is the, I guess it's all one long scene. It feels like a series of scenes, but it is one long scene because it all takes place in the same room. When we're first in the throne room / ballroom, and the king and queen have walked in, the new king and queen have walked in, Hamlet's uncle and his mother, and there are flower petals falling, and Hamlet is walking around brooding in his all black costume, and it just looks so great.
He wears so much black.
Yeah. Anything you can do to achieve a practical particle effect on film almost always looks great. Dust, mist, fog, fire, flower petals. Kenneth Branagh is a big fan of flower petals. But between the intro of Hamlet and the end of Much Ado About Nothing, I was like, wow, this guy really likes flower petals. But I get it because it looks great. It looks great on screen. And I think my favorite moment of that opening scene in the room, and it's a very long scene. They stay in the room for a lot. They have that set and they're going to use it. Dang it. Is when everyone is left and Hamlet is left standing alone on the diocese. What am I trying to say, Jonathan?
The little raised stage thing.
Yeah. And he's standing. So he's left alone, standing next to the thrones, and everyone's out of the room, and the flowers finish falling to the floor as he stands there all moodily. And I'm a sucker for anything that's really moody. So as that falls moodily to the floor, and he's left alone. And again, like I talked about with Much Ado About Nothing, with like how this is how like sixth graders act. Like Hamlet is supposed to be a fairly young character, and he's acting like a moody teenager over the course of the film. Like.
Well, he has reason in this film.
He does have reason.
More than in Much Ado About Nothing, because it was, as the title suggests.
It's like a moody teenager scenario on steroids.
With a backbone.
Tragic steroids. And he does take very decisive action because he's a good protagonist.
And one thing that I guess we should throw out here, since we haven't yet, is the fact that this is actually the only one that is taken out of its intended time period. I assume this would also be set modernly for Shakespeare, 1600s. But Branagh has actually adapted it to the 1800s in an interesting twist, which doesn't honestly change too much except for the aesthetics. So we have just slightly more updated things. We're still pre-electricity. We're still not a whole lot affects the story, which is how we can still use the entirety of the script without having to change any of the words that are specific or having to do something stupid like calling a gun a sword. Baz
Luhrmann. What? Who?
But one of the, as far as I could tell, one of the reasons for this change is that this is actually some of this staging and setting is actually based on a production that Branagh had starred in by the Royal Shakespeare Company around the same time before this movie came out. So I guess that was kind of an interesting change that whoever the director, Adrian Noble, I think, had made, and Kenneth Branagh really liked it. And so he decided to use those elements in his film adaptation, and it really worked. I mean, I don't know if that's a logistical thing where it's easier to make 19th century setting and costuming on such a gigantic scale than 1600s stuff, but
oh gosh, but that's an interesting question. If we had like a costume designer on the show, it'd be very
or a line producer.
Yeah, like how does the costume cost change based on what century it's set in?
I know it's still a period piece either way, but and it's still a 4-hour movie, so it's going to be expensive either way. We can definitely see kind of an higher appreciation for Branagh at this point, and the more that he's able to do, but he's still tackling what he likes, which is Shakespeare, and he's like, I'm gonna go all out this time. This may be, and this probably is right now, the only theatrically produced full-length production film of Hamlet, or maybe any Shakespeare film as far as I know, or Shakespeare's story.
We have not been able to find one. If you can find one, feel free to tweet us at either of our personal accounts or at the Film Links on Twitter.
Absolutely. But one of the other ways that Kenneth Branagh uses the film techniques in this movie is cutaways, which are really interesting because characters will be talking and he has a very rigid script. So if there's anything that he feels is not coming across completely, or that he wants to set up stronger, he has to kind of just, throw footage on top of it as opposed to changing the words to make it clearer. So, for example, showing when Ophelia is talking with Polonius about her relationship with Hamlet, and you kind of get a sense about, how involved they are, but adding extra scenes of seeing them in bed together kind of solidify it in the audience's mind, like
make it very explicit.
Right, exactly what that relationship is. And then also any discussion of Fortinbras, we have these little dramatic fade-ons of him with like military maps and stuff like that, which that one is interesting because it sets up what Fortinbras looks like for the audience, because we hear about him a lot and he doesn't come in until the very end. But since we've seen those little cutaways, we know who we're looking at when all of a sudden he shows up at the very end of the story.
Yeah. You get it's a nice, for anyone who didn't know the story of Hamlet and went and watched the movie just completely raw, which I feel like almost everybody who's gone through the American schooling system or any English-speaking school system would probably know at least the basics of Hamlet. But for anybody who didn't, you would expect Fortinbras to play a larger role in the plot than he does, which makes his arrival at the very end when he shows up to find the entire Danish royal family dead all the more tragic, and pointing out the kind of I don't want to say futility. I don't know. Just the tragedy of the entire plot line.
And irony.
Yeah, the irony of what was going on there. That you wouldn't have had if you were watching the movie for the first time completely raw and Fortinbras hadn't shown up until the very end, and you'd be like, who's this guy?
And again, I think like having a working knowledge of Hamlet, because I've read it a couple times, and there are so many adaptations, even just The Lion King gets you the basics of Hamlet, as many people have pointed out. But, I think that kind of helped carry me through this film a little bit because, again, you have to warm up to it. But also it's, again, the performances like we've been talking about. And even knowing Hamlet as a story, there were things that watching this performance of it, I was like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that about this character. Like Polonius, I didn't realize how kind of mischievous he was or how active he was in trying to break up Ophelia and Hamlet before all this craziness goes down, and stuff like that. There are just these things that either the way that it's performed or just having the full script in there really kind of enlightened me about the story. And so I thought that that was very interesting. And about the performances, once again, we have a very star-studded cast. And since we're doing the full show and we have cut out no characters, that leaves lots of openings for Kenneth Branagh to throw even more people in here. So, we've got Billy Crystal as the gravedigger, who famously gives Hamlet the skull of Yorick that he talks to in pretty much every rendition. Although sometimes he's holding a skull during the to be or not to be speech, which is kind of weird. But and then you've got Robin Williams comes in at the end for a really funny little banter with Hamlet. And you've got Charlton Heston as the player, who gets a really great monologue. Judi Dench, who we saw in Henry V, is just kind of like thrown in there a little bit. And you've got either Rosencrantz or Guildenstern. I'm not sure which one because the characters in the play never know which is which. But he has appeared in The King's Speech, and he's appeared in Harry Potter. You might know him from. But, all of these people will just kind of add to this really well-told story of a really great story.
Yeah. And I think it says something about the way Kenneth Branagh does an adaptation that so many big actors are willing to come back and work with him again and again. Like we pointed out with so many directors before that, they kind of have that cult of actors that likes working with them and will follow them around from film to film. But with Kenneth Branagh, it's not so much about the writing that they offer him, that they offer up as material, because you're working with Shakespeare. Almost every actor loves Shakespeare. But the fact that he's apparently he's just so nice to work with and so good to work with that you enjoy his techniques that promote acting, like we've been saying, in his films. You like being able to work with that and have your performance put up on that platform to be viewed by an audience, like we've talked about with his Oners. And he also uses a lot of close-ups, so you can get in and nice and close on actors' faces and really read their emotions, which is something you wouldn't be able to do in a stage play unless you were like in the front row, maybe.
Yeah, I'm always struck by the way he frames close-ups. And I think that all of these films had different cinematographers, honestly. So I am assuming that there is an element of direction that goes into the way that these close-ups and these long shots that we've been talking about come about, because these come through all three of these films. But the way he frames the close-ups is so precise, and again, kind of like a tableau. They're almost portrait-like, where, especially in like Henry V, you have so many little candelabras and things that you can place in the background, and whether they're lit or not, or foreground or background. And then in Hamlet, you've got, red drapes being behind someone's head in certain moments, and using that color theory again. And the other interesting thing about Hamlet is how well lit it is. Like, it's for the darkest of these stories. It is not the most impressionistic.
Dark.
Right. Like we talked about with Henry V, it's very bright. Everything inside the castle is very bright. There are a couple of night scenes, but they're not like too eerie. I mean, you've got the ghost scene and stuff, but that's mostly done through effects like the ground shaking and smoke and stuff like that. And I actually read a little blurb from a film critic that calls it film noir with all the lights on. And that's kind of what it is. It's noirish in its essence as Hamlet, but it's all very well lit and so precisely and beautifully shot that you're not getting the darkness from the cinematography, you're getting it from the content of the story.
Yeah, and I kind of like that contrast. because it resonates with the contrast that we get in Hamlet at the very beginning of the film, where everyone's telling him, you should be happy. This is a great occasion. Your mother just got remarried, but he's not happy at the same time. And he is the darkness brooding throughout this film. I am the darkness, or whatever. He's literally wearing black. And again, they do pull off some really cool wonders in this film. I think one of the most exciting ones, and one of my most personal favorite ones, is one where Hamlet is running away through these series of rooms.
Oh yeah,
he's just busting through room after room, and the camera doesn't cut. It's like a dollhouse pan that you might see in like a Wes Anderson film, or think that one really good intro to like season 3 of Community. If you're familiar with Community, you know what I'm talking about. And the set was designed so well. I mean, it was nominated for an Oscar for it. I think it might have won. But the entire palace is like this wonderland of opportunities for things you could shoot and things you can do. I mean, it's a room full of mirrors with hidden doors behind it, and each room seems to have a hidden door into another room. And there's just so much you can do with that. And there's like padded cells hidden somewhere in this palace, probably right off the ballroom, I think.
With viewing holes in the tiles on the walkway above. Like, it's crazy.
How's that practical? Oh, well, it looks cool.
Yeah, exactly. And it ends up with some cool framing. So, again, all of these things, like, we don't want to harp too much on the story, so we're kind of just getting into all the technical things that Kenneth Branagh does, because he does have his unique look. He does have that auteur aspect to him, especially in the way that he does these Shakespeare adaptations.
Yeah, so let's slide on over. Let's waltz on over to overall notes, and talk about one of the more interesting points I think this week. Because we don't have the aspect of writing today. We don't have all the material is established material from one of the best playwrights of all time, Shakespeare himself. So there's no question about whether or not the writing is good. What we're really looking at today is how it is presented. And maybe one of the most interesting things about that is that because it's Shakespeare, it's been presented so many times in high school productions, in many films, in many adult productions, professional productions over the centuries. So we're not really looking at the quality of the story here. We're looking at the interpretation of the story, and really like a super like kind of almost pure version of directorial intent, and what the director / actor, in this case the same person, really brings to the table in terms of their interpretation of classic material. And it's almost a nicer way to analyze how they do things than if we also had writing thrown in the mix. And we see that in all three of these films today. Like you mentioned, Jonathan, like none of these films had the same cinematographer. At least we don't think they had the same cinematographer. So all of the similar techniques throughout them are really things that Kenneth Branagh himself is bringing to the table, in the way he thinks is best to present these classic works.
Right. And we've seen actor-directors before, like Shane Carruth, and we've seen adaptations of classic work with Pride and Prejudice, but we haven't seen kind of unaltered, words and the same director interpreting 3 different works. So, right, it's very interesting to see how he does that and still makes it engaging. Like, these aren't boring. I mean, if you have any interest in following along with the story and understanding the Shakespearean stories, even if you haven't read them, you can do that because he portrays them so well. And as it's been said, 100 times, Shakespeare is meant to be seen and heard and not read. And you can really get that sense through all of these adaptations because, again, we've been talking about this. They're just performed so well, and Kenneth Branagh gives you those things when you need them to explain what's going on, like the little cutaways in Hamlet and stuff like that. But other than that, it's just the performance and the fact that Kenneth Branagh is able to bring that acting to the table. And he does have some of the technical knowledge. We're seeing that he knows when to call for long shots. He knows that how to do the close-ups and when to emphasize the face and when to emphasize the blocking, and how to get the best performance from his actors. But it's about the performances. It's about the delivery of the material. And he knows what he's doing and he does it well.
Yeah. And it definitely, like I mentioned before, it oozes through how passionate he is about this material and this opportunity he has to put on this material where he has near full control over how it's going to look and how it's going to be, as the actor-director, as the lead actor/director, where he really gets to put his stamp on basically the whole film.
And again, as an actor's director, it's really interesting to watch a film that puts so much emphasis on the acting and on the performances, and seeing how he can still keep the theatricality of all of these stories, because he comes from the stage and these stories come from being written for the stage. And the way that he's able to keep that with those long shots, being able to just hold on a scene, or especially on a performance. There weren't too many moments where it was just a wide shot, like what's called a master shot of the scene, and you're just seeing everything play out. Usually the only times that it's a long shot is when it's held on one character and seeing that performance, and watching them deliver the lines and seeing how the emotions come across their face and the actions that they do following the blocking. And even like the to be or not to be speech in Hamlet, it's very, he cuts out a lot of blocking. He doesn't do a lot of very dramatic motions and stuff. He's literally standing in front of a mirror, talking to himself, and he walks towards it and then he walks away from it, and the camera just slowly pans it. We're just watching him give the performance. And the same thing with the Battle of St. Crispin's speech. He kind of walks a little bit through the troops, but for the most part, it's just him giving the speech and the camera zooms in onto his face. So he's so aware of the performances and just really wants them to come across right, because that's what these are made for, and that's what he's doing them for, is because he has a heart for actors, and still making it not feel like we're just watching a stage version. Like, we still get something different out of it from the cinematic experience. He blends those two elements really well in each of these movies.
Yeah, it takes advantage of the unbroken performance of a theatrical portrayal, and it takes the mobile viewpoint advantage from a cinematic portrayal and blends them together, and exactly. It kind of takes the best of both.
But one of the things that we haven't really talked about, and Kenneth Branagh may deserve like his own second week, as we've talked about with a lot of these directors. We'll see if we can get around to any of them again, but he has quite a range. He has directed, let alone acted in so many other types of films. So the ones that you're probably most familiar with are like the first Thor movie was directed by Kenneth Branagh. The new live-action Cinderella movie was directed by Kenneth Branagh. He directed an adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And he's currently working on Murder on the Orient Express, which he is also starring in as Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot. And with a magnificent mustache. Yes, a great mustache. Quite different from some of the other Poirots that have graced the screen. But that'll be interesting too, because that is another very star-studded cast. I think that's literally the entire point of the trailer, was just kind of a tracking shot down the
Yeah,
train,
showing
and
you everyone who's in the film.
yeah, all the names just kind of popping up. So I mean, and it's characters that we've seen, or actors that we've seen in these movies, Judi Dench and some others. So again, we're getting that, and it'll be interesting to see how he does that adaptation of an Agatha Christie, and an Agatha Christie story that has already been adapted for the screen with a very star-studded cast from the 60s or 70s, I believe.
So it's kind of both a remake and an adaptation.
Yeah, so that'll be very interesting. And then, of course, he's acted in so many things, from Valkyrie to most recently Dunkirk, things that he did not direct. So, he's really all over the place. And, of course, he has a whole nother life of stage. Like we said, he has a theater company in England that puts on Shakespeare and other performances. So, there's so much to Kenneth Branagh, and these are just the Shakespeare adaptations, because that's something that we haven't talked about on the filmings before, is too much of Shakespeare, which, you can never go wrong.
More filmings than you could shake a spear at.
Oh boy.
Oh boy. Oh boy. And on that bad joke, let's talk about what we're going to talk about next week. What are we going to talk about next week, Jonathan?
So we just ran a poll on our Twitter account, which we haven't done in a while, but it's nice to get back into it, get some listener feedback on what you guys want to hear. And
or not
it's funny
hear.
Yeah, we will be talking about films that don't talk, which is silent films next week. And our listeners voted as our first American silent film star to do a deep dive, none other than the great Charlie Chaplin, which is probably a good starting place. We'll have plenty more to talk about in the future, but you can't go wrong with the Tramp. So we're going to talk about Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush from 1925, Modern Times from 1936, and The Great Dictator from 1940, and kind of trace him from the silent to getting into talkie era,
where he just kept making silent films and was still successful at doing it, which is fascinating. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us, or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, see ya.
I actually read an interesting trivia piece that they had to keep Robin Williams and Billy Crystal away from each other on set, because if they didn't, then everyone would start laughing too much and they wouldn't get any work done.
That's amazing.